Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has called for the release of unarmed innocent people arrested during violent protests in the country. Demonstrations began last month over an increase in fuel prices.
Meanwhile, demonstrations are underway in Iraq. Protesters are calling for an end to corruption and have actually forced the resignation of the prime minister there. Here to weigh in on all of this is Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and friend of the show. Great to see you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
All right, so let's start with Iraq. What led to the resignation here?
Well, you had several days, if not weeks, of protest. I mean, a second Arab Spring, essentially, going from Lebanon to Iraq. And in the Iraqi situation, corruption has essentially been institutionalized in the Iraqi government. So it's not surprising to see that it would reach some sort of a boiling point in which they wanted to have change. What is also fascinating is that so much of the anger is actually towards Iran because Iran is so close to the Iraqi government, which actually tells you that once the U.S. is no longer running the show there, whoever other country is stepping in and trying to take the position of being a dominant power in Iraq will also then pay the cost of all of the failures, all of the corruption, and all of the problems of Iraq. And that's part of the reason I think we should rethink the value of the idea of being a hegemon in the Middle East. It's actually far more headache than benefit.
That's actually a good point.
Yeah.
And so, turning our eye to Iran, then, we have, I think, the New York Times said it was one of the biggest crackdowns in over 40 years. What is the domestic situation? The Trump administration seems to kind of be, I guess it's a victory in a sense because they crashed the economy and they're showing that the domestic turmoil is materializing. What is the root of the protest? Is it actually putting pressure on the government to go forward to the negotiating table?
No, none of that stuff actually is taking place in the sense of this being a pressure for negotiations. Okay. What is happening here is that the combination of the sanctions that the Trump administration have imposed with the corruption and the ineptitude of those running the Iranian economy has come to a head. The population has been under tremendous amount of pressure for the last 2.5 years as a result mainly of the sanctions. But it's important to understand when you have a corrupt economic system, it actually is more vulnerable to sanctions. If they had a more robust, well-run economy, they would be able to withstand those type of external pressures in a better way. But what then happens is that the Rouhani government, or the government as a whole actually, announces with just a few hours notice that they're going to be spiking gas prices roughly 50%. They're at the same time going to do a cash system so that poor people would be able to get some compensation. But this was like a straw that broke the camel's back. People went out protesting. They've been living under all of this austerity for so much time. And, they had the expectation that things would be getting better as a result of the nuclear deal. And instead, because of Trump walking out, because of him reimposing sanctions, the economic situation has taken a nosedive.
It's so interesting that you say that. And it's also interesting because all of these countries obviously have their own very specific, very unique domestic political situations. And yet we're seeing in country after country uprisings over, a small tax is a WhatsApp tax is increased, the gas tax is increased. Both in Iran and in France, that was a trigger, right?
Exactly.
And so you see this sort of global movement of uprising that on their own they could seem disconnected, but it's hard not to draw a line between them. Corruption also is a significant factor in almost all of these protests.
Yeah, because the first thing you mentioned is absolutely true. We've seen these neoliberal economic situations and how austerity is just really putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the population. At the same time, they see a lot of people getting very, very wealthy.
Right.
And that then feeds corruption. And that creates that internal animosity in the sense that they feel like their situation is beyond what the rest of the country is experiencing. Everyone is not, essentially bearing the same cost. The poor population is bearing much, much more of that cost. And that is certainly the case in Iran. Now, the Trump administration is taking credit for this. And they are gloating on TV and saying that they're pleased with the situation. But I think that actually tells us something, that this economic pressure is aimed at fomenting unrest in Iran. But to what end? Because the academic literature on this is actually quite clear. When you put this type of economic pressure on a country through these massive embargoes, usually what happens almost all the time, with the exception of one case, is that the governments become more repressive in order to retain power. Because they're now more beleaguered and they are more afraid of the situation, they actually become far more repressive and even more adventurous in their foreign policy.
I was going to say, and belligerent, right?
Right.
I mean, that's actually the real danger. So tell us that from that perspective, what can we expect to see in Iran? I mean, domestically, what is the situation? How is Rouhani's position? He seems to be, I mean, he was the one who promised many of these things as a result of the nuclear deal. Is his situation precarious? Who has the power? And what can we expect to see, I think, in terms of their external action?
His situation is tremendously precarious, and there's parliamentary elections in a couple of months. That is likely going to lead to the way of the Conservatives. The Conservatives are trying to distance themselves from this, even though they were completely on board with it, in order to put all of the blame on the Rouhani government. But what essentially has happened is that people's faith in Rouhani and his ability to be able to change the situation has really been shattered. And in the next election, we may very well end up seeing another version of Ahmadinejad becoming president in Iran.
So
and that
hardliners coming into power.
Hardliners coming. And that is a direct consequence of the fact that Trump walked out of this nuclear deal, and instead of seeing more moderate elements in Iran being able to gain more influence and more standing in power, we've seen the opposite.
So we also wanted to ask you about your project, what you're working on, Quincy Institute. Tell us what you're all about.
So the Quincy Institute is launching today. It's a new think tank in Washington, D.C. I would say that it is a very different think tank in many ways. First of all, we're transpartisan. We have support both from the left as well as the right, because there are people on both sides that disagree on a whole different set of things, but they agree on one thing. U.S. foreign policy has systemic problems that is leading us into all of these endless wars, and we need to get out of those wars, and we need to change our foreign policy. And what we would like to see is a foreign policy that is centered on diplomacy and military restraint. So we're questioning some of the first principles of American foreign policy in a way that I don't think is really done in this town.
No, it's never done.
Takes courage.
And that's one thing we were talking about earlier, which is that there is no actual centralized institution in order to question the military consensus so much here in Washington. You basically have varying degrees of hawkishness from left and right. So how are you going to be playing a role going forward in these big debates here in D.C.?
Well, we're going to be challenging the status quo and be a disruptive force, I think. We want to change the conversation. And I think one thing that we've noticed, and one of the reasons why I think there's been so much support coming to this project, I mean, this would not even be able to get off the ground unless there was a critical mass of people recognizing that change is needed. We've noticed that there's a lot of people within the bureaucracy that actually would like to move in this direction, but they need external intellectual validation to be able, because they're not going to risk their jobs and their mortgages by questioning some of these things unless they can point to experts and people on the outside also calling for that.
Well, you see what's happened to Tulsi Gabbard. I mean, no one had, whatever you think of Tulsi and her views, no one has been smeared more than Tulsi Gabbard, who is a patriot, who is currently serving this nation in the military, and yet because she's dared to challenge this military-industrial complex bipartisan consensus, she's called a Russian asset, she's called a Putin puppet, she's called an Assad apologist. I talked about earlier, the New York Times accused her of looking like a cult leader because of her pantsuit. I mean, it's just been bananas, but you see, if you dare to challenge it, all the forces in this town will come after you, and you have very little backup.
Forces for status quo are doing everything they can to keep the status quo. And at the same time, when you do have a president that gets elected or a congressperson who wants to push in a different direction, then you have the entire establishment pushing back. And I think we saw that with Obama's first term, in which he was trying to do various things, but he was constantly getting pushed back. And I think
he ran on an anti-war message that was explicit.
And Trump.
So did Trump.
How many times does the man have to say, I want to get out of Syria? And the military over and over and over again is just saying, oh, we need 90 days more, Mr. President. We need 100 more days. Yeah, exactly. We're still in Afghanistan.
And we saw that with Obama, as you pointed out. We saw that with Trump. But also George W. Bush said that, the military is not for nation building, and then see what he ended up doing. We have a systemic problem. It's not just an individual here and there. We have a systemic problem, and it needs to be addressed in that manner in order for it to be able to change.
So interesting. So excited about what you're up to. Keep us updated, please.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate it.
Next on Rising, new American citizens could be a critical voting bloc in the 2020 election.
But activists are saying that politicians are ignoring them. We dive into a new study showing just how large immigrants' impact on 2020 could actually be. That's next.